I've hated leftism for a long time. But I was struck by something I read the other day. A person was writing about mass famines that have occurred in the world and got onto the subject of politically kind of inspired famines. Famines engineered for political purposes, which is a big part, which, in his opinion, had killed many more millions of people in the last 100 years or so than those resulting from natural catastrophes or agricultural failures or whatever. His starting point was a plan by the Nazis to engineer a famine in Russia during the Second World War in order to kill off the Slavs. And this engaged my interest because, as a total anti-leftist, I'm struck by the fact that the really great political famines, if I could call it that, of the 20th century were engineered by mad, idiot communists. Pol Pot in Kampuchea, Stalin in the Ukraine, and most infamous of all was the famine in China between 1959 and 1962, which is just a story, in its own right. It's just stands on its own as an example of this. But just going back to the article, just one little side issue that interested me was that the writer was going out of his way to focus on Nazi famine. Of course, the Nazis are the universally portrayed sort of monsters of modern history, and the communists relatively get off scot-free. The Nazis, Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and of course many millions in the war that he started. Of course, that's true. But in fact, communism is the real menace of modern history when it comes to mass murder, and it's amazing how, to what extent, that never really gets highlighted in the way that it should. The thing about the article was that the famine that the Nazis planned to engineer never actually came about. He said that in his estimation, some millions of people had died, but it's not as clear-cut and categorical as the other famines that have taken place in the 20th century. And only kind of then moved on to the kind of leftist, communistic famines that are more infamous in human history, which I thought was very typical of the way these discussions run. The famine perpetrated by Mao Zedong was a complete outrage. Not just in terms of what happened, because back in those days, nothing was kind of known. This wasn't discussed. It didn't come out for a couple of decades that something like 30 million Chinese had died in this famine during Mao's mad Great Leap Forward. But I think it tells you something about what's going on today, which I'll get onto in a minute. But this Maoist, communist, leftist-inspired famine really does not get much of a run, through the media or in sort of political discussions that are carried on around the dinner table. Initially, they said it was, I might say instantly, just by way of digression, because it occurred under the most totalitarian communist regime that ever existed. There isn't even a single photograph of this famine, which in itself is just, just a testament to how evil this regime and these kind of regimes are. At least with the Nazis, we get plenty of photos of the concentration camps, but in these communist totalitarian states, a complete blanketing of information. When they researched it, they decided that something like 30 million people had died in this famine. And every decade after that, they were bumping up the figures by another 10 million. They think it might be now 50 or 60 million people, Chinese people. Every one of them was a human being, just like you or I. And they died in this pursuance of this mad leftist communist idea. And not being out there in the general consciousness, as is all the crimes of that the Nazis have committed, is just representative of this mad idea that right-wing Nazis and fascists are totally evil, but at least communists have this inspired, idea about creating a society of peace and justice, and which I think is a load of codswallop, and they essentially get off scot-free for their evil deeds. The complicity of the leftist Western media, which is almost entirely leftist, Maoist. In fact, I portray modern Western culture as inspired by Mao's Little Red Book concept that the way we think about the world is what dictates how the world is, which of course is essentially true. But there's a big difference between the way people think and behave and the way they politically theorise, and leftists in the modern world either don't understand that or they will not recognise it. But the point of this discussion today is to just point out that, in my view, the leftism which dominates Western culture in the modern era is, I would call, a public menace. I mean, they are a menace. And they are a menace because they are genocidal. These leftists, these respectable-looking types that appear on the ABC and the leftist-dominated media and sound very reasonable and cool and, all very coherent. People who would send me to a salt mine for 25 years and not lose a night's sleep about that. And they're on the TV presenters, newsreaders up there, looking all so kind of nice and reasonable human beings. But like their boss, Mao Zedong, leftists, doesn't matter how reasonable they sound today, are genocidal. And they're genocidal in some very obvious ways that completely goes unremarked. I mean, if you go back to the 60s, the anti-Vietnam War campaign, which was fought on behalf of the people of Vietnam. And people would say, yes, but communism is, they engage in mass murder. This is what it's going to happen when these people take over, when they win the war. And when they won the war, what happened? In neighbouring Cambodia, where the communist forces were allied to the Vietnamese communist forces, they committed a genocide, which then got promptly got interpreted as a function of Richard Nixon's bombing of Cambodia, which these people completely failed to recognise that there were actual military reasons for this bombing, as in that the war in Vietnam was being prosecuted by communist forces all of whose men, equipment, supplies were in a neighbouring country. And anyway, but that's another story. So following their great victory, in helping to facilitate a communist takeover of Indochina, what resulted was a mass genocide, which was the worst genocide committed since the Second World War. And that, of course, brings me on to other subjects about support for abortion, the abortion holocaust, the murdering of innocent unborn children by their own mothers, incidentally, in their tens and hundreds of millions. And yet, the murder of 6 million Jews, is the greatest crime ever. And these people sanction the murder of innocent unborn children. And this is just crazy. And then there's AIDS, which came about through the unbridled male sexuality, if I can call it that, of the bathhouses of San Francisco, where men, with all kind of constraints thrown off, public approbation discarded, it was sort of discovered when they researched this that, a man living in San Francisco could have so-called sex with hundreds of other men in this culture of homoism, which came about in the 60s and kind of matured in the 80s San Francisco homosexual scene. And it was this incredible, there's male sexuality. I mean, you're not going to get this with normal heterosexual males and females. So you might find the odd male, you might manage to have sex with hundreds of women. The odd woman might too, but this interaction of a vast army of homosexuals, all of whom were just having unbridled sex with hundreds of partners, is what led to the AIDS epidemic. And of course, this is completely, whited out by the leftist Maoist media. They don't want to know anything about this. But the fact is, AIDS was and it remains a homosexual disease which has killed millions and millions of people. And the left get off scot-free with this. I go back to my original point. Leftism in today's culture is a menace. These people are a menace and should be treated as such.